Welcome to this journey through one of the most perplexing mysteries the Ozark Mountains have ever concealed within their winding trails. In the rugged hills of southern Missouri, where paths twist through ancient forests and logic bends as easily as creek water around stone, there existed a crossroads that defied every natural law. Comment where you're watching from as we delve into this reality-bending narrative. This video is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. The year 1897 marked a time when the Ozark Mountains remained largely unmapped territory, their hollows and ridges known only to those who had spent generations learning their secrets. The region was a maze of interconnected valleys and peaks, where trails followed routes established first by game animals, then by native peoples, and finally by European settlers who added their own layers to this ancient network of paths. Distance in the Ozarks was measured not in miles but in time. How many hours of walking separated one homestead from another? How many days required to reach the nearest town? And in this landscape where direction and distance held fluid meanings, there existed a place where these concepts lost all coherence entirely. The location that would become known simply as the Junction, though it appeared on no official maps and was referred to only in hushed conversations, lay approximately equidistant from three small communities. To the north was Stillwater, a settlement of perhaps 30 families clustered around a mill on a reliable creek. To the southwest lay Cooperton, a slightly larger town that served as a regional trading post. And to the southeast was a loose collection of homesteads, known collectively as the Providence District, too dispersed to be called a proper town, but recognized as a community nonetheless. These three settlements formed a rough triangle, with the Junction positioned at its center, a natural convergence point where trails from all three directions met. The crossroads itself occupied an unremarkable clearing in dense forest, a space perhaps 20 yards across, where 5 trails came together. The number of trails was the first oddity that residents noted when they began to discuss the place more carefully. By rights, a crossroads connecting 3 communities should have only 3 paths, or perhaps 4 if one counted the continuation of each trail beyond the meeting point. But the Junction had 5 distinct trails radiating from its center, each worn smooth by use, each appearing equally traveled. The 5th path led deeper into the wilderness, toward a section of the Ozarks that held no known settlements, and yet it showed clear evidence of regular passage. Historical records from this period are fragmentary, as was common for rural areas where literacy was inconsistent and formal documentation sparse. But letters, personal journals, and the accounts transcribed by traveling preachers and circuit judges provide glimpses into what transpired at the Junction during the year 1897 and into early 1898. These sources, preserved in various county archives and historical societies, paint a picture of a place where reality operated under rules that defied understanding, where space and time and causality became suggestions rather than laws. The first documented account of strangeness at the Junction comes from a merchant named Tobias Kern, who regularly traveled between Stillwater and Cooperton conducting trade. His journal, discovered decades later among family papers, contains an entry dated April 3, 1897, that describes an experience which troubled him deeply. Kern had set out from Stillwater at dawn, following the southern trail that should have brought him to the Junction by mid-morning, then onward to Cooperton by early afternoon. This was a journey he had made dozens of times, a route he knew with the confidence of long familiarity. But on this particular morning, Kern's journey deviated from its normal course in a way that left him profoundly unsettled. He reached the Junction at what he estimated to be the proper time, the sun's position confirming his internal sense of the hour. However, as he entered the clearing, he encountered another traveler, a man he recognized as Samuel Bridger, who farmed in the Providence district. Bridger was leading a pack mule loaded with furs he intended to trade in Cooperton. The two men greeted each other cordially, as was customary, and Bridger mentioned that he had left his homestead before dawn, intending to reach Cooperton before the trading post closed for the day. This casual conversation revealed something impossible. Bridger's farm lay to the southeast, and his route to Cooperton should have taken him southwest from the Junction, following a completely different path than Kearns. Yet both men insisted they had arrived at the Junction simultaneously, both entering the clearing from what appeared to be different trails, but both swearing they had walked steadily for approximately 3 hours. The trails they had followed, though originating from different directions, had somehow delivered them to the Junction at precisely the same moment. Kearns' journal continues with a description of what happened next. He and Bridger agreed to continue to Cooperton together, taking the southwestern trail that both knew would lead them to their destination. They walked in companionable silence, discussing occasional matters of weather and trade, and within what Kern estimated as 20 minutes, they arrived at Cooperton. But this arrival was accompanied by a revelation that troubled both men deeply. When they inquired about the time, hoping to confirm their sense of the journey's duration, the trading post operator informed them that it was still mid-morning, the same hour it had been when they left the Junction. This impossibility gnawed at Kearns' rational mind. 20 minutes of walking had transpired. The sun had moved across the sky. His body had expended effort. His legs were tired from the journey. Yet somehow, no time had passed. Or perhaps time had passed at the Junction and on the trail, but Cooperton existed in a different temporal flow. Kearns' journal entry concludes with a statement that reveals his deep discomfort. "I cannot reconcile what I experienced with any understanding of the world I possess. Either my perceptions are fundamentally unreliable, or the Junction exists outside the natural order. Neither explanation provides comfort." Bridger, for his part, returned to his farm in the Providence district the following day, and spoke of his experience to neighbors who gathered for a barn raising. His account, later recorded by a traveling preacher who documented regional stories, added additional unsettling details. On his return journey from Cooperton, Bridger had taken the eastern trail that should have led him back toward the Junction, from which he would follow the southeastern path to his farm. But he never reached the Junction, or rather, he reached it without realizing it. He had walked for what he estimated as the appropriate time, lost in thought about the prices he had received for his furs, and when he finally looked up to orient himself, he found that he had somehow arrived directly at his own farm, bypassing the Junction entirely. A journey that should have required 5 to 6 hours had taken perhaps 2, and he had no memory of the intervening trail. These initial accounts might have been dismissed as simple confusion, the sort of perceptual errors that can afflict even experienced travelers in wilderness terrain, where landmarks are subtle and paths can seem to repeat endlessly. But as spring progressed into summer, more reports accumulated, each adding layers of strangeness that suggested something far more profound than mere disorientation was occurring at the Junction. A circuit preacher named Reverend Elias Blackwood, who traveled a regular route serving the scattered communities of the region, encountered phenomena at the Junction that shook his theological certainties. Blackwood's letters to his denominational headquarters, preserved in church archives, describe his experiences with the careful language of someone trying to convey the impossible while maintaining credibility. In May of 1897, Blackwood set out from Stillwater, heading toward the Providence district, to conduct a series of revival services. He reached the Junction in the late afternoon, and decided to make camp there for the night, as was his custom when darkness threatened to overtake him between settlements. As he prepared his simple camp at the clearing's edge, Blackwood became aware of another presence. A man emerged from one of the trails, leading a horse laden with surveying equipment. Blackwood recognized him as Jeremiah Kane, a land surveyor who worked throughout the region documenting property boundaries and creating maps for the county. The two men greeted each other warmly, and Kane explained that he was heading to Stillwater to meet with a client regarding a boundary dispute. Blackwood mentioned that he had just come from Stillwater that very morning. They talked for perhaps half an hour, sharing a meal and discussing the challenges of traveling through such difficult terrain. When their conversation concluded, Kane mounted his horse and departed, taking the northern trail toward Stillwater. Blackwood watched him go, then settled in to sleep, intending to rise at dawn and complete his journey to Providence District. But sleep eluded him that evening. Something about the encounter troubled him, a nagging sense of wrongness he couldn't quite articulate. As darkness fully descended and the forest came alive with nocturnal sounds, Blackwood noticed something extraordinary. From the northern trail, the same path Kane had taken perhaps an hour earlier, came the sound of horse hooves and the creak of equipment. And then, impossibly, Jeremiah Kane emerged from the darkness, leading his horse, looking exactly as he had when he departed. Blackwood called out in surprise, asking Kane what had happened, whether he had forgotten something or encountered trouble on the trail. But Kane's response revealed something far stranger than a simple return. The surveyor had no memory of their previous conversation. As far as Kane was concerned, this was his first arrival at the Junction that evening. He repeated, word for word, the explanation he had given an hour earlier about heading to Stillwater for a client meeting. When Blackwood insisted that they had already had this exact conversation, that Kane had already departed and should be miles down the trail, the surveyor became defensive, then disturbed, insisting that Blackwood must be confused or perhaps ill. But the most unsettling aspect of this encounter was what happened next. As the two men argued about the nature of reality and memory, attempting to reconcile their contradictory experiences, another sound emerged from the forest. And from the northern trail came Jeremiah Kane for a third time, leading his horse, greeting Blackwood as if for the first time that evening. Now there were two versions of Kane standing in the clearing, both absolutely real, both insisting they were the original, both looking at the other with growing horror and confusion. Blackwood's letter describes what happened next in shaking prose, the words sometimes trailing off or being crossed out and rewritten, as if his hand could barely hold the pen to record such impossibility. The two versions of Kane approached each other, slowly, circling like wary animals, each studying the other for signs of deception or illusion. They were identical in every detail, wearing the same clothes, bearing the same marks of travel, even sporting the same fresh scratch on their left hands, where a bramble had caught them during the day's work. When they finally stood face to face, both reached out simultaneously to touch the other's shoulder, and in that moment of contact, something fundamental shifted in the clearing. The air became heavy and thick, as if the atmosphere itself had increased in density. Sound distorted, words stretching and compressing in ways that made speech almost incomprehensible. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the distortion ceased, and only one version of Jeremiah Kane remained standing in the clearing. The other had simply ceased to exist, not vanishing gradually or fading, but ending between one moment and the next, as if reality had decided that two versions could not occupy the same space, and had resolved the contradiction by eliminating one. Kane, the remaining version, had no memory of his duplicate or the encounter. As far as he was concerned, He had just arrived at the Junction for the first time that evening and was confused by Blackwood's strange behavior and stranger questions. The preacher, his faith in natural order shaken to its foundations, spent a sleepless night at the clearing, praying and trying to make sense of what he had witnessed. In the morning, he abandoned his plan to continue to Providence District and instead returned to Stillwater, where he spent several days in contemplation and correspondence, trying to find a theological or philosophical framework that could accommodate what he had experienced. As word of these incidents spread through the interconnected communities, other travelers began coming forward with their own stories of strangeness at the Junction. A woman named Martha Coleridge, who traveled regularly between Cooperton and her sister's farm near Stillwater, reported that on multiple occasions she had encountered herself on the trail. Not a mirror image or a vision, but another version of herself, walking the same path, wearing different clothes, sometimes appearing older or younger than her actual age. These encounters were brief and disorienting, usually lasting only seconds before one version or the other would disappear. But they left Martha with a profound sense of unease and a growing reluctance to travel alone. A group of 3 hunters from Providence District set out together in June to track deer in the forests south of the Junction. They separated to cover more ground, agreeing to meet back at the clearing by sunset. But when sunset came, all 3 arrived at the Junction simultaneously from the same trail, each insisting they had been hunting in different directions, each carrying different game that suggested they had indeed been in different locations. The geometry of their situation was impossible. 3 men entering from 3 different directions had somehow all arrived from a single path, and none could explain how this had occurred. The phenomenon at the Junction seemed to intensify as summer progressed. Distances became meaningless in the area surrounding the clearing. A journey that should take 4 hours might be completed in 20 minutes, or it might take 3 days with no clear memory of the intervening time. Travelers began carrying marked sticks, making a notch for each hour walked, only to find upon arrival at their destinations that the marks suggested far more or far less time had passed than their destinations' clocks indicated. It was during this period that a young schoolteacher named Elizabeth Wardle became one of the most documented victims of the Junction's strange influence. Elizabeth had accepted a position teaching at a small school in the Providence District and was traveling from her home in Cooperton to take up her new post. She departed Cooperton in the morning, following the eastern trail that would take her to the Junction, and then southeast to Providence. Her journey should have taken most of the day, requiring her to camp overnight before reaching the school the following morning. But Elizabeth never arrived at Providence District, at least not when she was expected. According to her own account, written years later and preserved in her family's papers, she reached the Junction around midday and paused to rest and eat the lunch she had packed. While sitting at the clearing's edge, she noticed something peculiar. The shadows cast by the trees were moving in the wrong direction. Shadows should shift slowly throughout the day as the sun travels across the sky, but these shadows were moving rapidly, cycling through an entire day's worth of positions in the space of minutes, then reversing and cycling backward, then stopping entirely while the sun continued its normal course overhead. Disturbed by this impossibility, Elizabeth decided to continue her journey immediately, rather than resting longer. She stood, gathered her belongings, and chose what she believed was the southeastern trail that would take her to Providence District. She walked for what felt like hours, the trail winding through typical Ozark terrain, and finally emerged into another clearing. But this clearing was not her destination. It was the Junction itself, the same place she had left hours before. Her lunch scraps were still on the ground where she had eaten, the paper wrapping barely disturbed by wind. Confused, but determined, Elizabeth tried again, this time carefully noting landmarks along the trail to ensure she didn't somehow circle back. She walked until her feet ached, until the sun began its descent toward the horizon and emerged once again into the Junction clearing. Her lunch scraps remained, and now she noticed something even more disturbing. There were other scraps nearby, other pieces of the same paper wrapping, arranged in a circle around the clearing's center. As if multiple versions of her lunch had been eaten in multiple iterations of the same moment. Elizabeth tried 5 times to leave the Junction that day, and 5 times she found herself returned to the starting point, though the path she walked each time felt different, showed different landmarks, and seemed to cover different ground. As darkness fell, she made camp in the clearing, frightened now, but seeing no alternative. She built a small fire and sat watching the flames, and as night deepened, she became aware that she was not alone. Other fires flickered at the clearing's edges, and around these fires sat other figures, all lone travelers, all trapped in the same impossible space. But here was the truly disturbing aspect of Elizabeth's experience. When she called out to these other travelers, asking if they too were unable to leave the Junction, their responses came from different times. One man, who appeared to be a circuit rider from his clothing and gear, spoke of the year 1891, claiming he had been trying to leave the Junction for 3 days. A woman in more modern dress spoke of the year 1902, not yet arrived from Elizabeth's perspective, insisting she had stopped at the clearing only minutes before. An elderly trapper spoke of the 1870s, describing events and people that Elizabeth knew only from history. All of them were trapped in the same location, but they existed in different temporal layers, their fires flickering in and out of visibility as whatever held them occasionally aligned their moments. Elizabeth's ordeal lasted until dawn, when something shifted in the clearing's nature. The other fires and their occupants vanished simultaneously, and Elizabeth felt a sudden clarity, a sense that the path forward was now open. She gathered her belongings and chose a trail at random, walking with deliberate purpose, refusing to look back or second-guess her direction. This time, after what felt like the appropriate duration, she emerged not at the Junction, but at a farmstead she recognized as being near Providence District. When she inquired about the date, she learned that 2 weeks had passed since she left Cooperton, though from her perspective she had experienced only one long, terrible night. The schoolteacher's account spread through the communities, and the Junction became a topic of fearful conversation. Some argued for avoiding the Crossroads entirely, finding alternate routes between settlements, even if they required substantially more time and effort. Others insisted that the Junction could be navigated safely if one understood the proper methods, though no one could agree on what those methods might be. Certain travelers claimed that carrying iron provided protection. Others swore by specific prayers. Still others believed the key was to never pause in the clearing, but to continue moving through, without acknowledging the space's existence. It was in August of that year that a more scientific approach was attempted. A county surveyor named Thomas Whitmore, intrigued by the reports and possessing a skeptical mind that sought rational explanations, organized a formal investigation of the Junction. Whitmore assembled a team of 5 men, including himself, all equipped with surveying instruments, compasses, chronometers, and detailed maps. Their plan was straightforward. They would approach the Junction from 5 different directions simultaneously, each man following one of the 5 trails that led to the clearing. They synchronized their watches before departing, agreeing to mark the exact moment they entered the clearing and to document any anomalies they observed. The results of this survey, recorded in Whitmore's professional journal, defied every principle of geometry and cartography he had been trained to trust. The 5 men departed their respective starting points at the agreed-upon time, but they did not arrive at the junction simultaneously, despite the distances being roughly equal. Whitmore himself, approaching from Stillwater, arrived at the clearing at what his watch indicated was 10:17 a.m. Another team member, approaching from Cooperton, arrived at 10:17 a.m. according to his watch, but his watch showed a different date entirely, claiming it was 3 days in the future. A third man, approaching from Providence District, arrived at what his instruments insisted was 2:43 p.m., yet the sun's position suggested early morning. When all 5 men had finally assembled in the clearing, though finally was a word that had lost all meaning in this context, they compared their instruments and findings. Every compass spun wildly when held in the center of the clearing, unable to settle on any direction. The chronometers, wound and set to identical times before the expedition began, now showed 5 different times and, in 2 cases, at different dates. Most disturbingly, when they attempted to measure the clearing itself, laying out measuring chains to determine its dimensions, the results were impossible. The clearing was simultaneously 20 yards across, 50 yards across, and immeasurably vast, depending on which direction they measured and at what time of day. Whitmore attempted to map the 5 trails radiating from the junction, plotting their courses with his surveying equipment. But his measurements revealed an impossibility that called into question everything he understood about space and distance. According to his careful calculations, all 5 trails led in the same direction, not toward different points of the compass, but along precisely the same vector. It was as if space itself folded at the junction, bending back on itself in ways that created the illusion of different directions, while all paths converged on identical trajectories. The implications of this discovery were profound and unsettling. If all trails led in the same direction, then travelers approaching from different communities were somehow following the same path despite their starting points being miles apart in separate locations. The junction wasn't merely a meeting point in physical space. It was a place where space itself broke down, where the normal rules of geometry ceased to apply, where distance and direction became fluid concepts, subject to forces beyond human comprehension. Whitmore's survey team attempted to leave the clearing together, thinking that strength in numbers might provide protection against whatever phenomenon trapped solo travelers. They chose the trail toward Stillwater, knowing that settlement lay to the north, and began walking in a tight group, maintaining constant verbal communication to ensure no one became separated. They walked for what their watches indicated was 4 hours, though the sun's position suggested far less time had passed. And when they finally emerged from the forest, they found themselves not in Stillwater, but back at the junction, approaching from a different trail than the one they had taken to depart. Whitmore called an immediate halt, gathering his team to reassess their situation. They had walked steadily for hours, never deviating from the clear path, never doubling back or circling, and yet they had somehow returned to their starting point. One of the team members, a younger man named Davis, began to panic, insisting that they were trapped, that they would wander these trails forever, that the junction was some sort of prison from which there was no escape. Whitmore attempted to maintain order, to approach their predicament with systematic rationality, but even his confidence was shaken by the absolute impossibility of their situation. It was as they stood debating their next course of action that something even stranger occurred. From one of the other trails, they heard voices and the sound of footsteps, and then, impossibly, they saw themselves. Another version of their 5-man survey team emerged from the forest, carrying the same equipment, wearing the same clothes, engaged in the same conversation they had been having moments before. The 2 groups stopped and stared at each other across the clearing, And in that moment of recognition, Whitmore understood something fundamental about the Junction's nature. This was not simply a place where space folded back on itself. It was a place where multiple realities, multiple timelines, multiple versions of the same events existed simultaneously and could interact. The Junction was a nexus point where parallel possibilities converged, where the paths not taken became just as real as the paths chosen, where every decision to turn left or right, to continue forward or stop and rest, spawned another iteration of the journey that existed alongside the original. Whitmore approached his duplicate cautiously, and the two versions of the same man stood face to face, studying each other with a mixture of scientific curiosity and existential dread. They were identical in every measurable way, but they carried slightly different memories of the last few hours. Whitmore's duplicate recalled choosing a different trail for their attempted departure, walking for what he insisted was 6 hours rather than 4, and encountering a lone traveler along the way, a detail that Whitmore's original version had no memory of. The encounter between the two survey teams lasted perhaps 20 minutes, during which time they compared notes, documented their observations, and tried to understand the implications of their coexistence. But as had happened in previous encounters reported at the Junction, reality eventually reasserted its preference for singular existence. Both versions of the survey team began to feel an increasing pressure, a sense of wrongness that grew more intense with each passing minute. And then, with a sensation that Whitmore's journal describes as being unmade, 4 of the duplicate team members simply ceased to exist, their presence ending so completely that it became impossible to be certain they had ever been there at all. Only one member of the duplicate team remained, a young surveyor named Morrison, who should have also vanished but somehow persisted alongside his original version. Now there were 6 men standing in the clearing where there should have been 5, and the duplicate Morrison was screaming, a sound of pure existential horror that came from someone who understood at a deep, intuitive level that he should not exist, and that his presence was a violation of some fundamental law. Whitmore made the difficult decision to abandon the survey. Whatever the Junction was, whatever forces operated there, they were beyond his ability to measure or understand with the tools and frameworks available to 19th century science. He led his team, now numbering 6 with the addition of the duplicate Morrison, back toward the clearing's edge, and this time, by what mechanism he could not explain, they successfully departed, emerging several hours later in a location none of them recognized, but which was at least clearly distinct from the Junction. They eventually found their way to Cooperton, where they discovered that 2 weeks had passed since they set out on their survey, though their subjective experience had been less than a day. The duplicate Morrison accompanied them, unable to return to his proper timeline, or perhaps no longer possessing a timeline to return to. He settled in Cooperton under an assumed name, living the rest of his life as a quiet carpenter, never speaking publicly about his origins, existing as a living remnant of the impossible events at the Junction. Whitmore's official survey report, filed with the county, made no mention of the temporal and spatial anomalies they had encountered. Instead, he simply noted that the Junction area presented unusual difficulties for accurate surveying and recommended that the region be marked as approximate on county maps. But his private journal, discovered after his death in 1915, provided a full account of their experiences, written in the precise language of a man trained in observation and documentation, making the impossibility of his claims all the more disturbing for their matter-of-fact presentation. By the autumn of 1897, the Junction had become legendary in the region, a place that was simultaneously necessary for travel between communities and profoundly dangerous to approach. Some travelers reported passing through without incident, completing their journeys in expected times along expected routes. Others found themselves trapped in temporal loops, or arriving at wrong destinations, or encountering versions of themselves that should not exist. There seemed to be no pattern to who was affected and who was not. No clear trigger that activated the Junction's strange properties, making each journey through the Crossroads a gamble with uncertain stakes. It was during this period that an elderly woman named Tabitha Crown, who had lived her entire life in the Ozarks and was regarded as a keeper of old knowledge, came forward with a theory about the Junction's nature. Tabitha was what the community called a knowing woman, someone versed in folk practices and old beliefs that predated European settlement. She claimed that the Junction occupied a place where the boundaries between worlds had always been thin, a location recognized by the native peoples who had originally inhabited these hills as a sacred and dangerous space. According to Tabitha, who claimed her knowledge came from teachings passed down through generations of knowing women who had learned from native peoples before they were displaced, the Junction was what she called a meeting place of all roads. Not just physical roads, but the infinite paths that reality could take, all the possible choices and outcomes that existed in potential, all converging at a single point. The native peoples had performed specific rituals at such places, ceremonies designed to maintain boundaries and prevent the different roads from bleeding into each other. But when the native peoples were driven from the land, these rituals ceased, and the boundaries began to collapse, allowing the different roads to intersect and interfere with each other. Tabitha offered to perform a ceremony at the Junction, a ritual she claimed would restore some measure of order to the space, though she warned that her knowledge was incomplete and the results uncertain. A group of community leaders, desperate for any solution that might make the Junction safe for regular travel, agreed to allow her to attempt the ceremony. She was accompanied to the clearing by a dozen witnesses, including Reverend Blackwood, who documented the event in a letter that survives in church archives. The ceremony itself was complex and drew from multiple traditions, combining elements that appeared to be native in origin with practices that seemed more European, along with aspects that Tabitha claimed were older than either, knowledge from a time before the current world had settled into its present form. She created a fire at the clearing's center and cast various substances into the flames, herbs and minerals, and other materials whose identities she did not reveal. She spoke words in a language none of the witnesses recognized, her voice rising and falling in patterns that seemed almost musical, and she traced symbols in the dirt around the fire using a stick cut from a specific tree, according to specifications she insisted were crucial. As the ceremony progressed, the witnesses reported feeling changes in the clearing's atmosphere. The air became heavy and still, and sounds took on a muffled quality as if they were underwater. The fire burned in colors that fire should not produce, blues and greens that seemed to come from the wood itself rather than from anything Tabitha had cast into the flames. And then, at what seemed to be the ceremony's climax, Tabitha spoke a final phrase and threw something into the fire that caused it to flare up in a column of light that reached toward the sky. In that moment, according to the witnesses, they saw the Junction as it truly was. The clearing became transparent, and through it they could see layers upon layers of reality, each one slightly different, each one containing different versions of the clearing and different configurations of the trails leading away. They saw themselves in these other layers, multiple versions existing simultaneously, some watching the ceremony, others passing through unaware, still others trapped and wandering in eternal circuits that never ended. It was as if the fire had momentarily revealed the full structure of the Junction, all its complexity and impossibility laid bare for mortal eyes to witness. The vision lasted only seconds before the fire returned to normal and the clearing solidified back into its usual appearance. Tabitha collapsed, exhausted from the effort of the ceremony, and needed to be carried back to her home, where she spent several days recovering. When asked what she had accomplished, whether the ceremony had succeeded in restoring order to the Junction, she could only shake her head wearily. She had done what she could with the knowledge she possessed, but the Junction's nature was beyond any single person's ability to fully comprehend or control. She had perhaps strengthened the boundaries slightly, made them more resistant to complete collapse, but the fundamental problem remained. In the months that followed the ceremony, reports of phenomena at the Junction did seem to decrease in frequency, though whether this was due to Tabitha's ritual or simply natural variation was impossible to determine. Some travelers claimed the Crossroads felt different, less oppressive, with a quality of normalcy that had been absent before. Others insisted nothing had changed, that the Junction remained as dangerous and unpredictable as ever. The truth likely lay somewhere between these extremes, with the ceremony having some effect, but falling far short of completely resolving the situation. As 1897 turned into 1898, the communities surrounding the Junction had learned to coexist with its strangeness. Travelers developed cautious strategies for passing through, personal rituals and superstitions that might have had no actual protective value, but provided psychological comfort. Some refused to stop in the clearing under any circumstances, hurrying through without pause. Others believed that speaking prayers continuously while traversing the crossroads kept them anchored in their proper timeline. Still others carried tokens, objects they believed held power, iron nails or salt, or written verses from Scripture. The duplicate Morrison, the survey team member who had persisted when his original version should have been the only one to exist, provided perhaps the most disturbing evidence of the Junction's lasting effects. He lived in Cooperton for several years, and while he outwardly appeared normal and functional, those who knew him well reported that he was fundamentally changed. He would sometimes stop mid-sentence and stare into empty air, as if listening to voices no one else could hear. He claimed to have memories that conflicted with each other, knowing that two different versions of events had occurred, even though logic insisted only one could be true. He reported dreams in which he lived entirely different lives, waking each morning uncertain which version of himself was real and which was the dream. In 1901, Morrison disappeared. He left his workshop one morning intending to deliver a finished cabinet to a customer and was never seen again. A search of the surrounding area found no trace of him, no evidence of foul play or accident. It was as if he had simply stepped out of existence, the way one might step through a doorway. Some believed he had returned to the Junction, drawn back to the place of his duplication, seeking answers or perhaps seeking to undo his own impossible existence. Others thought he had finally been claimed by whatever force had allowed him to persist beyond his proper timeline, reality finally correcting the error of his continued presence. The Junction continued to function as a necessary crossroads for the region, but it never lost its reputation for strangeness. Throughout the early 20th century, as the Ozarks slowly modernized and old trails were replaced by roads that followed different routes determined by engineering surveys rather than by ancient paths worn into the land, the Junction's importance declined. Travelers found alternate ways between communities, routes that added time to journeys but provided greater certainty and safety. By the 1920s, few people regularly passed through the Junction. The trails leading to it became overgrown, reclaimed by forest as human traffic diminished. The clearing itself remained, though it was visited primarily by those drawn by curiosity or by the region's growing reputation for strange places and inexplicable phenomena. Those who made the effort to find the Junction reported that it still possessed an unusual quality, a sense of being not quite properly connected to the surrounding landscape, though the dramatic manifestations of temporal and spatial distortion seemed to have become less frequent, or perhaps simply less obvious. Modern accounts from hikers and researchers who have located what they believe to be the Junction site describe a clearing that matches the historical descriptions, a roughly circular space where multiple trails converge in a configuration that seems geometrically impossible. Compasses still behave erratically in the area, and GPS devices sometimes provide conflicting readings or lose signal entirely. Time feels subjective there, with visitors reporting that hours seem to pass in minutes, or minutes stretch into hours depending on some factor no one has successfully identified. There have been attempts to study the Junction using contemporary technology, to measure whatever anomalies might be present using instruments more sophisticated than those available to Whitmore and his 19th century survey team. But these modern investigations have produced ambiguous results, readings that suggest something unusual, but nothing that rises to the level of scientific proof. Magnetic fields fluctuate in patterns that don't correspond to known geological features. Radio signals experience interference that can't be explained by terrain alone. But whether these phenomena represent genuine anomalies or simply natural variations amplified by the expectation of strangeness remains a matter of debate. The local communities, descendants of those who lived through the Junction's most active period, maintain a cautious relationship with the site. There are families who claim ancestors trapped in the Junction's temporal loops, people who stepped into the clearing in 1897 or 1898 and never emerged, who might theoretically still be walking those impossible trails in some layer of reality that exists parallel to our own. These stories are told with the understanding that they might be folk legends, or they might be something more, accounts of real people, caught in circumstances that defied every natural law. The question of what the Junction truly is, what forces operate there, and why they manifest in that particular location, remains unanswered. Tabitha Crown's explanation, that it was a meeting place of all roads where different potential realities converged, provides a framework for understanding, but not a mechanism. Modern physics offers concepts like quantum superposition or many worlds interpretation that might seem to relate to the Junction's behavior, but these are metaphors rather than explanations, ways of describing the impossible that don't actually make it less impossible. Perhaps the Junction represents a fundamental truth about the nature of space and time, a truth that our everyday experience obscures, but that becomes visible in certain places under certain conditions. Perhaps every journey we take, every path we follow, exists simultaneously with all the alternative journeys we might have taken, all the paths not chosen, and the Junction is simply a place where this multiplicity becomes apparent, rather than remaining hidden. Perhaps reality is not as singular as we assume, but rather a layered structure of possibilities that usually maintain strict separation, but can sometimes bleed into each other when conditions align. The travelers who found themselves trapped in the Junction's loops, who met themselves coming from other directions, who experienced time and space as fluid rather than fixed, were not experiencing hallucinations or delusions. They were experiencing reality in a more complete form, seeing through the comfortable illusion of singularity to the complex multiplicity that underlies all existence. And having seen it, having experienced it directly, they could never fully return to the innocent assumption that the path they walked was the only path, that the life they lived was the only version of that life, that the moment they occupied was discrete and separate from all other moments. We have reached the end of this journey through one of the most reality-bending mysteries the Ozark Mountains have ever presented. The Junction remains where it has always been, Or perhaps it never truly exists in a single place at all, but rather serves as a point of convergence for infinite places, infinite times, infinite possibilities. The trails leading to it are overgrown, but not impassable, and those who seek such things can still find their way to the clearing where all paths lead to the same destination, which is simultaneously every destination and no destination, depending on which layer of reality one occupies when making the crossing. The story of the Junction reminds us that the world is stranger and more complex than our daily experience suggests, that the boundaries we assume are fixed might be more flexible than we imagine, and that space and time, direction and distance, past and future, might all be constructs more fragile than we want to believe. In the Ozark Mountains, where mist still clings to ancient hollows and old paths wind through forests that have forgotten more than they remember, such places persist as reminders that reality is not a simple thing, and that there are crossroads where all journeys intersect, where every traveler meets themselves, where the path forward and the path back might be the same path, leading simultaneously to every destination and to none. If you've made it this far on this journey through the twisted paths of the Missouri Ozarks, consider subscribing to Commutales for more stories that explore places where reality bends and breaks. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and if this story resonated with you in any way, A-Like helps bring these narratives to more people who appreciate mysteries that challenge our understanding of the possible. Until our next journey into territories where maps fail and certainty dissolves, drive safely, and remember that not all crossroads are what they seem, and not all paths lead where they appear to go.